Good morning. Our passage for Sunday will be 1 Samuel chapter 18 verses 1 to 13. I'll pause now if you'd like to read that, but I intend to read it as we go through the message. Okay, David, fresh from his victory over Goliath, is made a courtier in Saul's household. Chapter 18 of 1 Samuel gives us a glimpse into Saul's court. We meet three people and are shown three incidents, each of which teaches a spiritual lesson which is as true today as it was in the age of Saul and of David. The first person we meet is Saul's son Jonathan. Verse 1. As soon as he, that is David, had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him, that is David, that day, and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and gave it to David, and his armour, even his sword and his bow and his belt. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. This is a passage about friendship. Having good friends is important. Mental health specialists identify 6 positives that come from good friendships: improvement in health outcomes, encouraging healthy behaviour, emotional support, building confidence and self-esteem, reducing stress, pushing us to be our best. Christians need friends. Church should at least in half be about friendship. I think we often substitute the word fellowship. I guess that's okay. We mustn't assume that fellowship is simply sitting in a meeting, sitting next to each other while we listen to a sermon. That might be the beginning of fellowship, but it's entry level. Fellowship, if it's become true friendship, must move on from there. Notice 2 things about the friendship between Jonathan and David. First, it was a covenanted friendship. Verse 3. We could spend all day talking about covenants and miss the point. Covenant means, 1, that they were committed to each other. They agreed a friendship that they were determined was for all their lives, to support each other whatever the circumstances or personal costs. And 2, in a covenant, one partner might be stronger than the other. In the case of Jonathan and David, one was the king's son and the other a peasant boy. Do you have friends who are committed to you through thick and thin? Do we as a church, as Christians, seek to build friendships like that? Are you in a position of power, wherever it comes from? Do you put that aside to make covenant friendships with those weaker than yourself, or only make friends with those of a similar social position to yourself? Friendships that benefit you, or friendships which might make demands on you? And the second thing about the friendship between Jonathan and David, it was a giving friendship. Verse 4, the friendship was practical. Notice, the wealthier Jonathan gave to poor David. Later in the relationship, it would be the other way round, King David supporting the needy family of dead Jonathan. How good are we, at practical support? There are 2 telling verses that need no comment from me. The first is in James 2, and it's verses 14 to 17. What good is it, my brothers, If someone says he has faith but does not have works, can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And the second passage is 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Let me extend this out a little. In Romans 12, Paul gives a list of practical gifts that ought to be endemic in the life of the church. One of the gifts is encouragement. At Christianity Explored on Monday evening, we were discussing Romans 12 and the list of gifts there, and we discussed the gift of encouragement. We said it was a way God gives us to support each other. An encourager is more aware of others than they are of themselves. An encourager will walk through the church or through the street and smile at those they meet and say, "Hello." An encourager will see pain and put their arms around those who hurt, not just their friends. An encourager will see need and ask what they can do to help. Encouragement is a demanding gift, just like friendship. The second person we meet in chapter 13 is Saul. Let me pick it up from verse 6. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul kept an eye on David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It may be that you're using the NIV or some different translation. You'll note that the NIV translates the word here, he prophesied. The Hebrew word can be translated prophesy or rave. The context determines the meaning. And here the context suggests that Saul raved. The next day, verse 10, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." You see, he saw what seemed to him an easy way out of his difficulty. Get rid of the guy. Get rid of the threat, the challenge. But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. If we're to understand what's going on in these verses, we need to take a moment to review Saul's career to date. Saul was appointed king of Israel back in 1 Samuel 10. He actually made a good start, but his reign rapidly goes downhill. he made in quick succession 3 major wrong decisions. He suffered defeat to the Philistines, and he left the army under-equipped. Remember, the first task of any government, then or now, is the defence of the realm. So Saul has a poor record, and it's one that's likely to lose any leader support from amongst the people. But in addition to that, Saul made some seriously bad spiritual decisions that tellingly cost him the support of God. And in chapter 15, the Lord tells Samuel the prophet that Saul will be given no more chances and that he, God, intends to appoint a new leader. Samuel conveys this to Saul. He's quite blunt. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. 1 Samuel 15 verse 27. Now, to have that hanging over you is a big thing. To go through your days as king and have echoing in your mind, the Lord has rejected me as king, that must have been terrible. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 14 we read, "Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. We have here a mind in pain." Bring that to these verses. Now there's this new buck in town, David, who defeated Goliath, while Saul, and in fairness, the rest of Saul's army, hid quivering in their tents. David is a gifted soldier and leader, while Saul stumbles around out of his depths and in despair. Saul felt the comparison, and he made it. He knew everyone else was making it, the comparison between himself and fresh young David. So when Saul hears the ladies of Jerusalem singing, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, to a mind full of self-doubt and suffering from depression, words can't express how difficult that must have been for him. And then Saul makes his next major mistake. Instead of turning to the Lord and praying and asking for strength, Saul dwells on it. He eyed David from that day forward, verse 9. Here is a spiritual battle in the mind. And Saul festers. He breeds jealousy. He nurses bitterness. And within 24 hours, bitterness erupts, verses 10 and 11. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. A harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. What are we to make of that? Well, here is what I think is going on. Romans 1 gives a thumbnail sketch of human wickedness and of our falling away from God. And we read a terrible sentence, God gave them up. It occurs 3 times, each more terrible than the last. Verse 24, God gave them, that is humanity, God gave them up to uncleanness. Verse 26, God gave them up to vile passions. Verse 28, God gave them over to a debased mind. Between each giving over, we're told about different aspects of human rebellion against the Lord. God gave them over in response to human action. Actions have consequences. And I think that's what's going on in 1 Samuel 18. You see, nowhere does Saul pray. He dwells in his miseries and allows bitterness to grow, and God gave him over. And he throws the spear at David. He needed peace. And he can only find that in repentance and in seeking the Lord. The very thing he does not do. And I think the lesson is obvious. Like Saul, we are in a spiritual battle. And so much of Satan's attack can be focused on the mind, how we see things. Do you lack peace of mind? Pray, pray, pray. I want to briefly return to verse 5 and link that to verses 13 to 16. 13 to 16 are part of next week's passage, but they're a link between today's passage and what follows, so I think it's all right to include them now. Verse 5, and David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And down to verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Here is the third person we meet in chapter 18. In the difficult atmosphere of Saul's court, David got on with doing whatever he was asked to do, to the best of his ability. Twice we're told that the Lord was with him, and 3 times that David was successful in all he did. He went about his business. He relied on the Lord. He didn't run away. The time would come for David to leave Saul's court, but until that moment he bore all and served on. Jonathan's friendship and the enmity of Saul were God's training ground for David's future. All this happens to us, all that happens to us in this life is God's training us for the future that he has for us, especially the eternal future. Soldier on, knowing that he holds and keeps you and is working out his good purposes for you.